it was the fear when Zelensky went to the Oval Office this past winter. And as you'll remember, he got his head handed to him with very sharp criticism from both the president and vice president. Since that time, this turnaround has occurred where Trump has recognized Putin playing him, that Putin's been essentially dangling and then withdrawing concessions. And Zelensky himself has been very clever about developing a much better relationship with Trump and with Washington overall, with the help of the European allies.
Well, just tell us, first of all, what you make of the prospects of these three-way talks. We heard there from President Trump saying that he thought it would happen. The White House earlier was saying that the Russians wanted it to happen. How significant do you think this could be?
I take note that President Zelensky in Ukraine, when he gave his evening talk, which he's done to the nation every day since this war began in February 2022, he said that he saw more indication of the Russians being ready for a real ceasefire than he'd seen before. And I take that very seriously. When Zelensky says he's seeing a little glimmer of light, then that's, I think, significant. So we shall see. As I understand it, it would first be a bilateral meeting between Trump and Putin. Evidently, some kind of progress would have to be made in that setting for then it to turn into a trilateral interaction with Mr. Zelensky. The president pointed to the fact that young men are being killed, young people are being killed. By the way, Russian young men, North Korean young men, and in Ukraine it's women and men who are getting killed. But he also took note of the fact that in the past that he's been able to really get more prisoners exchanged and that type of thing. So I think that starting with a kind of phased approach where we'll see more prisoners exchanged, perhaps see resolution of that problem where the Russians kidnapped many young children and sent them into Russia, getting some resolution on that. And furthermore, I think we've heard hints out of the Kremlin that they're considering a ceasefire for the aerial bombardment of Ukraine. And they would ask the Ukrainians to do the same, to cease launching missiles into Russia. So there could be a number of steps along the road that I think would lend momentum. And if they do so, we'll be on our way to a true peace process. But it is going to be step by step.
Do you think that President Putin is serious about some form of ceasefire? Clearly, an aerial bombardment would be at least or a ceasefire in the aerial bombardment would be at least a start. Do you think President Putin is serious about moving towards a ceasefire?
Well, John Herbst in your last hour posted, I think, a wise warning that Putin is in this for his own purposes. He hasn't changed his conditions for ending the war. He wants all of those 4 provinces in the eastern part of Ukraine. And he wants NATO basically to have hands off Ukraine and not to allow progress toward NATO membership for Ukraine. So at least on the surface, Putin has not changed his goals and objectives, and he continues to talk tough. So I do think we're right to be skeptical. On the other side of the ledger, the Russian economy is under pressure, and all of Trump's talk about ramping up sanctions, including secondary sanctions, for example, today on the Indians for their purchases of Russian oil, I think that will be also gaining attention in Moscow. So I think they have a brittle economy that they're dealing with inflation high and other problems for the ruble. So they have got to pay attention to the economic strain as well.
Is there a risk that President Putin, as he has done in the past, is just playing the US president here by perhaps agreeing to talks, perhaps talking about a partial short-term ceasefire without actually having any real intention of ending the war or halting the military offensive, those efforts to take those 4 provinces which you mentioned?
You know that President Trump himself a couple of months ago noted point blank that he knows Putin is playing him. So the president's eyes have been open to that. He said just now in that interview, again cited on your program, that he's been disappointed before. So I think the advantage now is that his eyes are wide open and he knows he has to turn the screws on Vladimir Putin. That's why I found it extremely significant today, even though Trump just criticized President Biden, but he essentially endorsed the executive order that Biden signed in February of 2022 that declared a national security emergency for the United States because of Putin's invasion of Ukraine and started the process of ramping up sanctions against Russia. So essentially, today, Trump said, I agree that we have still a national security emergency with this war going on in Ukraine, and we have to continue those sanctions pressure against Russia. So to my mind, he's gotten the message that he can't allow pressure on the sanctions front to loosen up until he gets some real results out of Vladimir Putin.
How difficult do you think this is for President Zelensky? He's got these two superpower leaders there meeting. We know that President Trump wants to try and come away with some form of a ceasefire. We know that President Putin is, as you've described already, a pretty wily operator. Do you think there is a risk that President Zelensky could find himself perhaps caught between these two big leaders?
Yes, sandwiched between them, I think, perhaps as a meal. That has been the fear in the past, Carol, and definitely it was the fear when Zelensky went to the Oval Office this past winter. And as you'll remember, he got his head handed to him with very sharp criticism from both the president and vice president. Since that time, this turnaround has occurred where Trump has recognized Putin playing him, that Putin's been essentially dangling and then withdrawing concessions. And Zelensky himself has been very clever about developing a much better relationship with Trump and with Washington overall, with the help of the European allies. And so I do think that Zelensky's in a much better place to stand his patch, to be able to work together with both the NATO allies in Europe, but also with the Trump administration to try to get a fair deal for Ukraine. It's not going to be easy, but nevertheless, he's in a much better place than he was this past winter.
And just finally, what about the chemistry when President Trump meets President Putin? Presumably, there will have to be translators there, but it's going to be all about how President Trump confronts the Russian leader, isn't it? They did meet, 5 years ago now, but that is going to be crucial in terms of if there's any progress in this, isn't it?
Well, definitely. And when they met 5 years ago at their famous summit in Helsinki, Trump, by all reports, seemed to be simply agog in admiration of Vladimir Putin and his tyrannical authoritarian ways. He seemed to really like the man on that basis, which gives us pause in the United States, you can imagine. But I will say once again, Trump has been watching Putin carefully. He's been disappointed by Putin since he came to office in January. And furthermore, he's had this very skilled envoy, Steve Witkoff, going back and forth, maintaining an open channel of communication. And so I think there too, with that kind of open communication with the Kremlin and with Putin himself. They met for 3 hours today. That Witkoff, I think, can really advise the president quite effectively on how best to handle Vladimir Putin in any upcoming meeting. So I do think for a number of reasons, we're in a better place here too than we were back in 2019. It seems to me that Trump isn't ready to just be in mute admiration of Vladimir Putin.